here, which implements some of the core behavior type functionality for the menu control, and we'll see how we would implement our own look to the menu control, and that's done in a separate cascading style sheet, which we'll get to in a moment. And then in the case of the menu, as I said, there is a JavaScript file that implements some of the client-side functionality necessary for the menu to do its normal operation. So one approach to using the CSS control adapters is that you could include the appropriate source code files in your own website. They would get compiled, and then you would utilize the control adapter via that compiled version of the source code. And the other is to use that CSS-friendly.dll assembly, which has compiled into it all of the source code and as the JavaScript files you see here embedded. And then you only have to implement or use, I should say, the appropriate cascading style sheet in your website. In the sample website that we saw, I chose to use the compiled assembly version of the CSS adapter controls because that's most likely the way that you would want to implement them in your own website. And before we go off and look at specifically how that is implemented, we should take a look at the menuadapter.vb file here to see what the source code is behind the scenes that's overriding the HTML rendering process, so you have a bit of a perspective on that. So let's open up the menuadapter.vb class and take a look at what we have here. So essentially what we're doing in our menu adapter class is that we are overriding the parent menu adapter class in adapters.menuadapter, and then we are doing two things. First, we're overriding some of the methods in the parent class, and then we're adding some additional methods that implement the necessary rendering functionality that we want. So let's take a look here at what's going on, and essentially we go down here. The first method we're overriding is the onInit method, and after calling the base onInit, we are registering the JavaScript class, or I should say JavaScript file that's associated with a menu called menuadapter.js down here. And all of that this code is doing is looking to see whether or not that JavaScript file is in a default /JavaScript folder, or it may be in a completely different folder, and if you do move it to a folder other than the /JavaScript, you need to add a tag to the web.config file. So once we've registered the JavaScript, then the next method that we're overriding is the begin tag and the end tag rendering methods. Each of those methods receives an HTML text writer as a parameter, and then that writer is used to write out the appropriate HTML to the stream going down to the browser. And one thing to point out in the begin tag method here on line 51 is that the first thing that's happening is we're writing a div, and that div is being given an attribute, a class attribute on line 52 called CSS selector class. And remember that when we go and look at the implementation or the declarative syntax for the menu control on our actual web page, because that's a very important factor in determining which style sheet values get used in rendering your menu. Then we go on to render another div as a container for the menu, and one thing I should point out here that you'll see throughout this code is that in addition to rendering the actual HTML element, we are rendering class attributes for use in associating the appropriate styles in our cascading style sheet to the different elements on the page. And as I said, the main purpose of this control adapter are really two purposes. One is to render alternate HTML, and the second is to control the look of the control, the menu control in this case, by using a cascading style sheet. So here in this menuadapter.vb class, as we're doing the rendering, we are creating specific classes that are associated with different parts of the menu control in this case. And so there is a certain degree of standardization here in that you have to follow a convention when you're creating your cascading style sheets that matches the class names that are being implemented here during the rendering process. this, and we'll look at the cascading style sheet in just a moment and we'll see that in detail. So after we render the begin tag, we have the render end tag, which basically closes things off, and then the real meat of this is down here in the override of the render contents method. And in this render contents method, we're calling a method called build items, and in that we are actually rendering all of the menu items using the unordered list and the list item HTML elements as we saw on the sample web page. And I'll leave that to you to go off and download the source code and look at all the details of how we're actually implementing the rendering of the different menu elements. However, the basic approach is essentially the same. We're rendering both an HTML element and an associated class attribute that allows that element to be formatted using a cascading style sheet. Now, if you were to look at the other controls that are in here, such as the details view, data list, etc., you would see a very similar process where the appropriate HTML elements and associated style names are being rendered for that control. So now let's go take a look at the other sample website that I have implemented here that we looked at in the very beginning of the video and see in detail how you would implement, in this case, a CSS control adapter menu on your own website. So what we'll do is collapse down this friendly sample website, which again was created using the project template that was installed with the ASP.NET CSS control adapter toolkit, and we'll go take a look at our sample website here. There's several pieces that you need to add to the website, and the first one is in the bin folder, the CSS friendly assembly. You may not have a bin folder in your website, so if not, just create a new folder and place the CSS friendly assembly in it. The second thing you need to do is to put the cascading style sheets that relate to the menu control in your project or website. Now there's two cascading style sheets here. The first one is called menu.css, and that actually comes from the toolkit. If we go over here to the CSS folder, you'll see here is that menu CSS, and all I did was copy it over to my sample website project. And menu CSS contains what we might call the behavior for the menu. It doesn't contain it contains very little in relation to the appearance of the menu on the page. So what you do to separate the behavior from the appearance of the menu is, by convention, you should implement another cascading style sheet that has the look or appearance of the menu, and I've done that here in the menu CSS file. Now the standard menu CSS file is pretty simple here, and as you can see, it's got just a few styles in it that relate to some of the visibility and position of the menu. And if we go over here and look at the CSS menu, again, CSS menu is the cascading style sheet that I implemented specific to this website to provide the look of our menu on the sample page. And one of the important things to note in our own CSS menu, which again is specific to this page or this menu, is that we have created styles that extend the styles that are in menu.css. And in this case, I've called all of our styles CSS adapter